want to explain quickly, well, maybe not so quickly, what it is I'm looking for in the paper itself, what it is I'm asking you to do in the paper itself. So the first thing you need to do, obviously, is pick a case and research that case, right? So there are really, really good, reliable resources out there that um, actually linked to in Moodle for finding good, solid analysis and basic explanation of the cases themselves, right? So find reliable data on the case itself, which you will find from legal websites. If you go to Wikipedia, which I'm not one of those people who's anti Wikipedia, if you go to Wikipedia, make sure that the information you're looking at there is cited and go to the sources of the Wikipedia page, right? All those things are cited. Go to those references, that reference section on the Wikipedia page, and look at those. Um, in the paper, the first section of your paper should be an explanation of what led to the case, right? What was the controversy, right? So, person A did what, person B or entity B responded. Here are the details of what it was. It was about this film that was considered to be pornographic, or it was about this story that was considered to be a threat to national security. What were the details of that story? Blah, 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 blah. So the first part of your paper should just be explaining the controversy, right? So what happened that created a court case? The second part of your paper should be what was the findings of the case, right? What did the Supreme Court ultimately decide? And as I mentioned before, it's not just a simple, they were for or against, but what was the count, right? Was it 6-3? Was it 7-2, 8-1, 9-0, 5-4? And what was the majority finding, right? Again, I've mentioned this before. When the Supreme Court rules on a case, the majority writes an opinion, right? One justice is responsible for writing the majority opinion, which explains their reasoning, right? Why did they rule this way? What was the point that the case hinged upon? But then there's also a minority finding, right? So uh, what is the word? Son of a bitch. Uh, dissent. There it is, the dissent. The minority opinion is also written, and that's called the dissent. So, what did the majority think was the reason this case should be ruled the way it was? And why did the dissent disagree? Why did those justices who disagreed, why did they disagree? Right. So, part two is what were the actual findings, the substantive findings of the case? Part three is what has happened since, right? How has this affected American life, American society since it was ruled upon, right? Since this became the law of the land. So if you're dealing with a case about, libel, right? How has the landscape of American media been affected by these guidelines for libel being more clearly defined or shifted? If you're dealing with obscenity, how has the American media landscape changed or been affected? What is it? What can you point to today that's a direct result of this case coming to this conclusion? Right? How has this affected us today? So those are in essence the three parts of the paper I'm looking for. How you weave that together, how you stylistically do that, I leave that up to you. I'm not very prescriptive on writing style. You have your own writing style you've been cultivating for your entire life up to this point. I'm not going to ask you to redo it right now. How you write the paper is up to you, but those are the things I'm looking for within that paper. I need to make sure that number one, you understood what the controversy was. Number two, you understood what the finding was and the reasoning for the finding. And number three, you understand how that law or how that case has affected American society since. Okay. Is that pretty clear? Is that a pretty good enough explanation for you guys?
Yeah.
Does anybody need more clarification? Or is there anything in particular you're wondering about?
Do you want a reference page or a works cited page?
Yes, please. Yeah. If you're citing a source, if you're using a source in your paper, you should absolutely cite it in a reference page. MLA, APA, Chicago, I don't care. Format is not really my concern. They're all just a bunch of BS anyway. But yeah, you should, if you're gonna cite a source, you should give adequate credit to that source in a reference page.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Are we writing more of like a summary of the case, or just like describing both sides? Or
Yeah, I'd say describing both sides, right? So kind of like we did when we went through some of these cases in class, right? Like Near versus Minnesota, right? What was the controversy in Near versus Minnesota? A publisher, a newspaper publisher in Minnesota, was publishing the names of people who had been arrested for violating prohibition laws, right? And it turns out that one of those violators was the governor's like nephew or something, and the governor decided that he was going to try and impose prior restraint in that publisher to say that they couldn't publish anything anymore without prior approval. Near sued and said you're not allowed to do that, and went through the Minnesota courts until it eventually got to the Supreme Court of the United States. Right. So that whole story, right? That whole here's what happened, here's what the response was, how did we get to this point, right? So yeah, tell us the story of how it got to the Supreme Court.
okay.
Any other questions? Cool beans. Well, in that case, we can move on with the actual lesson today. And that is about media theory and research. And I kind of teased this subject at the very beginning of the class where I said, there's a lot of common questions that come up in the public sphere about media in the United States. Like, does media make kids violent? Does media create, this is bullying worse because of media? Blah 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 blah. There are all those questions out there, and people act like it's a rhetorical question. People act like it's this, like, oh, guess we'll never know. No, we know. Like, we know the answers to those questions. Like, we've done the research on this stuff. We know what the answer is. It's just that it's more fun for people to speculate and pretend like we don't know the answers. So we're going to look at some of those answers. What does the research actually tell us when it comes to some of these significant controversies that take place surrounding the media landscape in the United States? To get into it, we have to start by delineating between quantitative research and qualitative research. And if you're going to go into any kind of social science field, this is a distinction you need to get locked into your head right away. All of the social sciences, so all of the, psychology, sociology, media, if you're dealing with human beings, right? If you're dealing with human beings and you're trying to figure out behavior of human beings, you're dealing with social science. And all of those things, all of those fields have both qualitative and quantitative research. Qualitative research is research that places an emphasis on interview and observational data, right? Qualitative data is where something occurs, right? And I'm going to observe it and I'm going to apply my observational findings to that explanation, right? I'm going to interview participants, right? I'm going to, interview a bunch of serial killers and find out what makes them tick, what drove them to be who they are. Okay. Qualitative research is descriptive by nature. It is designed to explain why something did happen so that we can look for patterns in future behavior as well, right? In future instances. I'm describing what occurred with the underlying premise that things happen over and over, right? Things tend to follow patterns. So if these 12 things are all in common for a bunch of serial killers, it's pretty likely that if I see all 12 of these things in another person, they are at a high likelihood of becoming a serial killer, right? The emphasis here is on quality of data, not amount of data. Thus, qualitative research. Contrast that with quantitative research, and quantitative research places an emphasis on numerical data and statistical analysis. Quantitative researchers want to make human behavior as mathematically explainable as possible. Quantitative researchers are looking for predictive data. They're trying to predict what will occur based upon information that they have quantified and enumerated in their research. For example, quantitative data will always rely upon what's known as the N factor. So N equals 1, N equals 0.5. Let's say I do a survey, right? I do a survey where I ask 500 college students, you know, whether or not they think that meat is murder. Okay. Well, I want to just ask them that one question, right? Because that's not really going to give me any predictable data. All it's going to give me is, do these 500 people tend to think one way or the other? But if I also get all their demographics, right? If I find out the age of those 500 people, if I find out the sex, if I find out the sexual orientation, if I find out the income level, if I find out the religious beliefs, if I get all of that other data, and I find out if they believe meat is murder, I can then say those who are Catholic are 3 times as likely to believe that meat is murder when compared to evangelicals, right? Or I can say that women are 4 times as likely to believe meat is murder than men, right? I can find those relationships between one piece of data about them, a demographic piece of information about them, and a psychographic piece of information about them, a belief that they have, an opinion that they hold. And again, the emphasis here is on quantity of information, amount of information. I want a large sample size. I don't want to talk to them. I don't want to take their personal experiences into account. I just want raw, unfiltered data. A qualitative study to determine who, is more likely to be vegan is going to be really, really hard, because in a qualitative study, I'm doing interviews, I'm observing people. There's a lot of nuance involved. In a quantitative study, no nuance whatsoever. Just give me the numbers straight away, just hard and fast data. And there are strengths to both, right? There are some things that you really aren't going to be able to figure out qualitatively that you can only figure out quantitatively. And vice versa. There are things that you can't figure out quantitatively that you can only figure out qualitatively. Both have their strengths and both have their weaknesses. And both forms of research are perfectly valid and necessary in understanding human dynamics and understanding human behavior. In our specific cases here, both are absolutely critical in understanding what effect media has on a population. If we want to know, does media make people violent? Right? We're going to need both qualitative and quantitative studies to figure that out. If we want to know, are people more likely to believe something if they hear it from the news than if they hear it from their neighbor? We're going to need both qualitative and quantitative explanations for that to figure it out. And so that's why we do both. Right? That's why we do all different approaches. To further understand how this kind of media theory, media research works, you need to understand the different epistemologies that are at play in social science research, right? Epistemology is just a fancy way of saying schools of thought, right? An epistemology is a study of knowledge, right? So how do we approach this? How do we believe that research should work? And one of the most popular schools of thought, one of the most popular epistemologies, is what's called positivism. And positivism asserts that there is an objective reality and we can explain it, right? There is an objective reality that exists and we are capable of studying it, of observing it, and explaining it. Probably the best explanation of positivism I ever heard was from one of my mentors in graduate school, who he said that positivism is a brick wall. Because one of the criticisms you hear all the time about social science research, if you go to the library, like when they're open, and you grab an academic journal, right? The titles of these articles, right? The subject of these studies are just fucking ridiculous. It's like, let's look at the effect of this television show on Guatemalan children from 1982 to 1984, within the context of social justice. Why? Why the hell do I care about what Guatemalan children watched for 2 years in the 80s? Like, how is this in any way relevant to my life? What does this do for me? And again, that's a common criticism you hear of social science research is, like, why are they studying this shit? Well, it's because of positivism. It's because of the brick wall theory. The idea that I'm not going to figure out the world's secrets by knowing what Guatemalan children did for 2 years. But when I take that brick and I put it next to the brick of how did Bolivian children respond to something similar in another time period, and I put that brick next to how did American children interact with something similar in a different time period, when I put all those bricks together and then I stand back, I get a wall of knowledge, right? Each brick is necessary to build the greater conclusion. Positivism, again, is based on the idea that all of these little pieces, all of these little bricks need to be there and are dependent upon each other to create a wall that we can then study, right? We need all of these things to build this wall of knowledge that we can then sit back and look at and go, okay, that's why this happens and that's why that happens. So there we go. Positivism presupposes that, number one, there is an objective truth, capital T truth to the world, and we can study it, right? Like it or not, there is a reality that is true for everyone, and we can identify it. I realize for a lot of you, that statement is well, duh. But that's because you're not thinking about it all the way through. Because as much as people like to immediately jump on board with the idea that, yeah, of course there's an objective reality, you'll argue the opposite sometimes and not realize it. For example, post-positivism, right? Post-positivism is a school of thought that came about after positivism that argues that, yeah, there is an objective reality. We're with you on that. But there are some things that we just cannot figure out through science. There are some things that aren't scientifically provable. My favorite example I like to use in my critical thinking class, which you should all take, by the way, because it's fun. It's awesome. It's me. My favorite example to use in that class is, how do you prove that someone loves you? Because as much as we like to talk about objective reality, we like to talk about absolutes and, like, oh, no, if you can't prove it, okay, prove someone loves you. You can't. That's the punchline. You can't. I can prove that people do things I consider to be acts of love, but I can't scientifically measure love. I can't scientifically measure something like that. And if you admit that, if you accept that, congratulations, you're a post-positivist. Because yeah, I can prove that my kids stole my food, but I can't prove that they love me. Some things do have an objective reality, but some things don't. Some things will never be explained through scientific research. All right, so that's post-positivism. Another school of thought that's important to know is what we call social constructionism. And social constructionism argues that knowledge is a social construction. It's a social construct. And I realize in the year 2020, that saying social construct gets people all worked up. But get over yourself, stop listening to Ben Shapiro, and know what the damn word means before you act like an asshole. Yeah, I said it. That's right. If you listen to Ben Shapiro, you're an asshole. Knowledge is a social construct, and all that means, right? All that means is the idea that you know something isn't provable. Well, I could tell you all about it. Of course I know it. No, you know what we know. but what we know could be wrong. See 98% of scientific discovery in the last, 2 millennia. You don't really know something as true or false empirically, objectively. You know what other people confirm to be true. Again, put this into a different context, put this into a specific instance, see if it makes more sense. Do you know someone loves you? Well, you can't prove that. Right? You can't prove that. We've already been over this. You cannot objectively, scientifically prove someone loves you. So how do you know it? Because you meet enough of the standards that we as a society have determined to be knowing. That's how you quote unquote know it. No one really fully knows anything, right? But they know enough that the rest of us agree that they know it. Your doctor doesn't know what's wrong with you, but we all agree that they have the best probable guess of anybody else. Their knowledge is really just society saying we agree that that's probably the best idea. That's the idea of social constructionism, right? Is that we're really just kind of all agreeing that that's what that is. And again, I realize for a lot of people that causes consternation, it causes quite a bit of dissonance, and there's a lot of pushback to that. But it making you uncomfortable and it being wrong aren't the same thing. It makes a lot of people uncomfortable to think that knowledge is made up. But that doesn't mean it's not. It just means that you're uncomfortable. Sorry. Now, again, this is not to say that no one loves you. That's not the point here. This is not to tell you all you are unloved. The point of this is to say there's a difference between what you can prove and what you can know. There's a difference between what is and what you think is. That's all. That's not to say these things don't exist. It's just to say that they're not provable. Postmodernism is another one that gets a really, really bad name these days, right? Postmodernism is the boogeyman for a lot of people. A lot of culture warriors blame postmodernism for all these problems. They couldn't define postmodernism if you put a gun to their head, but they're going to tell you that that's the reason that everything sucks now. And again, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. You should be better than that. You should know what something is before you blame it for all of society's ills. So, what is postmodernism? Postmodernism is the idea that truth is relative and unknowable. Again, obviously, controversial idea. That's going to get a lot of pushback from people. Totally get it. Totally get it. But is it wrong, or is it just something that makes you uncomfortable? If we understand that knowledge is a social construct, right? If we buy into social constructionism, if we buy into the idea that what you know is really based on a bunch of other people's best guesses, couldn't what you know as the truth be wrong? Have you ever known something in your bones only to find out later you were wrong? Of course you have. Of course you have. We all have. Well, that's not truth, though. That's just my opinion. My opinion was wrong. My belief was wrong. Okay, well, then what differentiates your belief and truth? You believe things that are untrue? You thought it was true when you believed it. That's why you believed it. Oh, so you're telling me you didn't know what the truth was after all? Weird. It's crazy how you didn't know what the truth was, even though the truth is totally knowable. and totally permanent. Crazy. Again, I get it. I get why people don't want to like postmodernism. It's icky, right? It leaves a bad taste in your mouth. But facts don't care about your feelings, bro. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it makes you feel icky. The truth is that every single human being on earth has lived postmodernism. They've experienced postmodernism. You can make it the boogeyman all you want. It doesn't change the fact that it happens. Sorry, not sorry. See, this is why Ben Shapiro won't debate me. I've publicly challenged Ben Shapiro to debate multiple times. He won't take me up on it because he's a pussy. He's a coward. Ben Shapiro is afraid of me. Start that hashtag. Ben Shapiro fears Jim Yeager. Get that going on Twitter. I'll give you guys extra credit. Hashtag Ben Shapiro is afraid. Get that trending and you all get an A. Okay, I want that motherfucker. I want a piece of that wormy little shit. Pragmatism is the next epistemology we need to know about. I don't know why I bother. I don't know why I bother to do it. You guys don't care. You don't care. It's just I don't have anybody else to talk to, so this is what I do. Pragmatism. The idea that there is no universal truth with a capital T here, but rather truths are found in successful actions. Specifically as it applies to social science, as it applies to human behavior, there is no such thing as a universal truth for motivation, for example, right? There is no silver bullet that will absolutely make anybody do the thing I want them to do. There are multiple ways to get people to do what I want to do, and you know that it's true because it works. Right? Spanking, right? That's still a controversy today. Spanking your child. Should you spank your child? All of the research says no, right? All of the research that we have says no, it doesn't work. It is not going to get you what you want. But I can think of a few times where spanking worked. I can think of some times where getting my ass whooped is what was necessary. Ta-da! Pragmatism. So again, pragmatism isn't, there's no such, like everything is made up, do whatever you want, which is what people tend to go to, right? They hear this idea that there is no universal truth. So, see, it's all moral relative and you get away with murder. No, that is not what it is saying. It is saying what works for you doesn't work for somebody else, and that's okay. Pragmatism isn't saying do what you want, it's saying do what works. Because you may want to beat the shit out of your kid, but it ain't gonna work. That's the difference between this absolute, this lack of all morality that the straw man tends to be turned into versus the practicality. The realities of pragmatism is no, it doesn't work. It's not that it's wrong, it's that it doesn't work. Success determines correctness. I realize I've thrown a lot at you on this slide, so I'm just going to kind of like let you breathe for a minute while you reevaluate everything you've ever thought up until this point in your life. Would you simmer in that for a little bit? And also give you guys time to tweet out Ben Shapiro is a bitch. Hashtag Ben Shapiro fears Jim Yeager. If you guys can do that while you're at it, that'd be awesome. That'd be great. I'd appreciate it. That's how I get famous, guys. That's how I make my millions, is by humiliating Ben Shapiro in public debates. It's not hard. Like really, I could probably send my kids in there to do it. But, yeah. Okay, so we've gotten some background now, right? We've looked at, all right, what kind of research is done in these fields? What are the kind of schools of thought? What are the frames that people are looking at this research through? Now, let's look at kind of overarching philosophies about media criticism. Right? Now, right out of the gate, I want to be clear. When we use the word criticism, that doesn't mean being mean, right? Unfortunately, the common usage of criticism for a lot of people is like, oh, you're criticizing, you're being mean. No, in this instance, when we're talking about criticism, we're talking about evaluating thoroughly. In other words, it has nothing to do with whether or not you like it. It has nothing to do with your personal experience with the thing. To critique something is to remove your personal feelings and evaluate it on its face. Okay. So when we say media criticism, we're not saying, like, oh, here's why the media sucks. We're saying, here's how to evaluate it without addressing your own feelings in it. Okay. One of the foundational approaches to Marxism in media criticism is what is known as cultural studies. And cultural studies is the study of culture as a tool for maintaining social and power structures. And this is something we've already mentioned before in this class, the idea of cultural studies. Cultural studies, if you're in cultural studies, you're looking at media as how does media help to maintain and reinforce power structures and social structures within a society. Well, what are some of those power structures within a society? Well, the dad is the head of the household, right? The patriarchal family line. Does media in the United States help to reinforce the idea that the dad is the head of the household? By and large. Are there breaks from that? Yeah. But how are those breaks met? How are those breaks from that structure met? A television show where there's no dad? Do they exist? Of course they do. But how are they met? How does society meet those shows, react to those shows? How do the shows portray the situation? Do they portray the fatherless home as being happy, as being well run, as being just fine? Or is the fatherless home the chaotic home? Is the fatherless home the one that is always beset by problems that could only be fixed if there was a man there? If the show portrays a fatherless home that's doing great, everything's happy, how does society meet that show? What is the reaction to that show? Do people get outraged because it is harming the fabric of society by showing this? It wasn't that long ago that people were freaking the fuck out because shows were portraying gay people as not evil. Wait, that person is gay? They can't be on television. You can't have a character like that on television. Why not? Not like gay people don't exist. Why shouldn't they be on TV? For fuck's sake, it wasn't that long ago that you couldn't show a black person in a relationship with a white person on television. You can now. Now it's perfectly fine. But it wasn't that long ago that it was not fine. Cultural studies looks at exactly that kind of situation that says, how does media, again, reinforce and maintain those traditional structures? There's a very important concept in media these days called representation. The idea that representation matters. There are lots of different groups of human beings in the world that they don't have representations of themselves on television. They don't see themselves in movies. They don't see themselves in popular media portrayals. And that matters. That is significant. I'm a big comic book guy, right? I mentioned this before. I'm a huge comic book person. And when the MCU came out, right, when all the Marvel movies started being made, right, I was super, super excited because these were, this was my childhood on the screen. I was so excited. I love these stories, love these characters. And then people started getting really upset because some of the characters were cast by people of different ethnicities or by people who didn't look like the comic book version. My favorite of this was Heimdall, right? In Thor, right? Heimdall in Thor was cast as Idris Elba. Okay, if you guys don't know, Idris Elba is a black man. Well, people were losing their damn minds because why would you cast a black man in a movie about Norse mythology? There were no black people in Norse mythology. How could you do this? Well, guess what, dipshit? Heimdall isn't real. Who cares? You're not ruining a historical figure. You're not misrepresenting reality by making Heimdall black. Heimdall isn't real. The fuck? But it's very notable that people lost their minds. People got mad at the idea of a black man playing a Norse figure. That's rife for a cultural studies research project. Seeing a black person on screen in a position of power in a positive light has a positive effect on the black audience. That's why Black Panther was so important. Seeing a gay character presented as normal or as powerful has a very powerful effect on the gay population, on the gay audience. Representation matters. As a straight white guy, I've spent my entire life seeing heroes as who are straight white men. You can't swing a dead cat without hitting a movie or a TV show or a book where the hero is a straight white man. But if you're growing up as a woman, or if you're growing up as a black woman, or if you're growing up as a trans woman, who are your heroes? Who looks like you? Who do you look up to? Right? That's the idea here of representation. That's why cultural studies are important. Because media isn't just about entertainment. Media isn't just about fun. Media helps to reinforce cultural standards and beliefs. And how we use that media sets up the next generation for what is considered normal or abnormal. Another important idea is the idea of political economy. Political economy is the idea of that we need to study the relationship between economics and politics in media. One of my mentors in graduate school, who was kind of he was a political economist to his core, right? This was his driving thought process behind everything, is political economy. And the way he always explained it was follow the money. You want to understand why a media business, why a media entity does something, follow the money. A couple years ago, Nike made a big old ruckus because they officially named Colin Kaepernick as one of their spokespeople, right? They made a deal with Colin Kaepernick. He was going to be the face of Nike. And this was after all of the controversy, right? This was after he had been basically, benched from the league following the kneeling controversy. And people all over were like, oh my God, why would Nike do this? This is insane. Why would Nike do this? This is such a terrible idea. Actually, turns out it was a very, 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 very good idea. After naming Colin Kaepernick as a spokesperson, after naming Colin Kaepernick as the face of Nike, they saw an increase in sales. Not a decrease, an increase. If you're a political economist, you say, well, there you go. They didn't name Colin Kaepernick the face of Nike because they believe in Colin Kaepernick. They named him the face of Nike because they wanted the money. Why does Fox News present a very biased approach to the news? Because it makes them money. Because it's a successful strategy for making a profit. Make no mistake, right? Make no mistake. If tomorrow the Murdoch family discovered that they could triple their profits by becoming the most left-leaning communist news station in the history of the world, they would be putting up, Lenin and Stalin's images every 5 minutes on screen. Ideology is not the driving force of these decisions. Money is. Profit is. That's the political economy approach to understanding the environment, the ecosystem of American media, is follow the money. Why do film studios continue to put out really shitty remakes? Because they make money. It's not a commitment to anything other than profit. Why do entertainment studios tend to recycle the same group of executives? Money and politics. They know each other. There's a political gain, not political in terms of government, right? But politics in terms of internal relationships. There's a political gain to hiring those same group of people, to working with that same group of people. It's not that other people couldn't do it, it's that they don't carry that political gain. They don't carry the weight. It's a bit of a cynical approach, right? Admittedly, political economy is a bit of a cynical view of the media landscape, but it's hard to argue with it too. It's cynical, but again, does that make it wrong? Does that just mean it sucks to think about it? I tend to, and again, admittedly, because one of my mentors was a political economist, I tend to see the media landscape through this lens too. I tend to, naturally gravitate towards that idea that, yeah, it's a financial decision, right? It's not an ideological decision. That's how I tend to view a lot of media moves, is just looking at it through the lens of political economy. But it's not the only lens, and I recognize it's not the only lens. It's just the one I tend to gravitate towards. Oh. Okay. Again, throwing a lot at you here. Throwing a lot at you here. This is one of those units what I really, really, really wish we were in person, because I love to have this conversation. I love to have a back and forth about this kind of stuff, especially the epistemologies, because it's if you think about it, it fucks with your head, right? If you don't think about it, it's really easy. But if you actually think about it, it really can hurt. So I like to do this as more conversation, but here we are. So, okay, so we'll call it there. We'll end it there. On Wednesday, we'll pick up right before Thanksgiving, which you guys should all be available for, because nobody's going anywhere. Because you better not, because I will find you and I will yell at you. You won't like it, because I have a really, really mean dad voice. Okay, so I will see you guys on Wednesday. In the meanwhile, be safe,